Hello and welcome to our webinar, Ensuring Your Long-Term Service Agreement is Fit for the Future. I'm Craig Nicholson with IEM Energy Consultants, and our panel for today's webinar include Jason Yost, who is a partner at the law firm Mercer, Thompson, as well as Bill Ray, who is a senior consultant with IEM Energy Consultants. Our panel brings expertise in long-term service agreements from a technical, commercial, and a legal perspective. So why are we doing this webinar on long-term service agreements? Across the electric power generation market, gas plant owners dealing with an ever-changing landscape. Three trends in particular have emerged that will shape how we should view LTSAs, be it a new or a renegotiated contract. First, LTAs have continued to evolve and adapt to the changing energy markets, with providers offering more commercial flexibility, taking on more risk, and extending coverage. Second, competition among providers continues to increase with the maturity of offerings of independent service providers, as well as OEMs moving beyond just servicing their own equipment. And third, renewable energy resources continue to come online, materially changing the operation profile of gas plants and subsequently their maintenance requirements. The continued proliferation of renewable energy resources has been quite shocking, reversing past trends of principally base-loaded gas turbine operation. Renewable energy is the fastest growing energy source in the United States, increasing 100% from 2000 to 2018, comprising more than 17% of net US electricity generation in 2018. And while they're able to provide a carbon neutral energy source, the intermittent nature of renewables, with no real means to store energy for future use, means that they are not a reliable energy source for baseload operation. As a result, gas turbines are increasingly being called upon to adjust their operation as demand for electricity fluctuates throughout the day. Further, low gas prices on competitive markets combined with renewable generation coming online ahead of thermal technologies on the dispatch stack has led to extremely competitive day-ahead energy markets with thin margins. LTSA costs really do matter, even for assets that want to stay relevant in a balancing authority or in the regulator portfolio. Renewable penetration will continue to outpace thermal technologies and continue changing the operation profile of gas plants going forward. We've seen the phasing out of coal moving at a pace much quicker than most thought, leaving gas plants positioned as the balancing thermal energy for the grid. Though commercial flexibility in maintenance contracts is a must to sustain a competitive advantage in today's and tomorrow's dynamic energy mix. Looking at the future, all three of these trends will influence how you view your gas plant operations and maintenance, as well as any such maintenance or long-term service agreement. So moving to the panel with Jason and Bill, I'd like to bring Jason in, and starting with regards to the LTSA landscape, what does it mean to you and why should we care?
Well, I think as these trends illustrate, things are changing, and while any one of these changes would impact how an owner is going to look at their LTSA and look at their operation and maintenance going forward, the combination of all three of these changes is causing the shift to happen at an even increasingly faster pace. And assumptions as to how gas turbines are going to be operated and maintained in the future, as well as to how risk is going to be allocated between the parties, is changing at the same time. And so owners need to be thinking about these changes and how they're going to impact their operation and maintenance and their LTSAs in the future. And if they're locked into a 10 to 15 to 20-year agreement with one set of terms, they're not going to be in a position to be able to change with this changing environment.
Yeah. And so Bill, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you look, these agreements all started 20 years ago with the advent of new technology, limited amount of suppliers, little limited amount of experience, and projects that were prolifically growing across the whole U.S. It allowed the buyers to secure equipment, maintenance contract, and then go look for a project. a lot has changed over that time. Now operators much more familiar with their equipment. There's more supplier base to work from. And really the F class now is more like the heavy duty industrial than it's ever been before. But an LTSA still makes sense. There's great opportunity to offload risk. There's great opportunity to secure a great supply chain, but it is a buyer beware market. And this brings up kind of my next point is the landscape shifts that we've seen over time. You know, this all started with, prolific growth in projects and huge expansion in the industry, followed by $12 gas and no one was running and the projects dried up, to the golden age of $2 gas, and now we're working into coexisting with renewables. And that's going to drive a whole different shift, and the next generation of LTSAs have to address that fact.
Great points, great points. So Bill, where do you see the market heading with regards to operation and maintenance contracts?
Well, if you look, LTSAs generally are renewed and revised based on the pain of the past. And you look back and those poor experiences then in turn drive the behavior going forward. This needs to flip. For the next 10 years, you need to be looking forward into this change in landscape, change in market environments, and adapt accordingly. The service providers, this portfolio of LTSAs is huge to their operating margin, and they need to have these agreements. And they need to have customers that are successful and that are running units. So they will change and they will adapt in technology, they'll adapt in price, they'll adapt in terms, but maybe not on their own because they've got profitable portfolios that they're trying to keep up, and they really don't want to take risk on their own fruition. So you need to go approach them in a structured, methodical way and get them to change the agreement and present that in a case that it's easy for them to follow, easy for them to work with. Now, as operators, you're also going to see changes. You're going to see changes in the number of starts. You're going to see changes in the number of part load operation. You're going to see increased competition from the renewables that Craig mentioned. And you're going to see more competition from these newly super efficient combined cycle plants that are being installed. And what that's going to do is it is going to put pressure on some operators on their profitability as they get pushed down the dispatch curve and don't operate as much. Yeah. So, and basically where that's going to get to is your LTSAs generally are built on an hour equals an hour. Hour of running time is an hour's worth of billing. And if you're running at less than full revenue, that's going to put further cost pressure on you. Okay, operators are also going to need the ability to pivot and adjust their contracts over the next decade. The thought of a fixed 25-year contract just isn't going to work in this coming environment.
So Jason, say I'm in a 7 of a 20-year agreement, and we speak about recalibrating. What does that mean for a typical agreement being 20 to 25 years? How can this even be an option?
Well, I would suggest to you that most LTSAs rarely see the end of their naturally occurring term. In fact, I would imagine that many of the users out there have already renegotiated their contracts once, if not twice or even 3 times. And this opportunity to renegotiate your contract is just the right opportunity to kind of look at this recalibration. This opportunity can come up in any number of ways. One of the more frequent ones we see is where the service provider maybe has an upgrade or performance enhancement that they're offering, and they want to roll that into your current contract. Maybe extend the term as part of doing that. So that's one of the more prevalent areas where we see the renegotiation opportunity. Another may be you've got an off-ramp. Maybe you've got an opportunity to get out of your contract after the completion of the first major. Maybe you have a termination for convenience right. They do still exist. So that's another opportunity for owners to kind of look at their terms. Another opportunity we see, unfortunately, is because of a forced outage. Maybe there's been a catastrophic event, and now you've got a whole influx of new or different parts than what were originally anticipated. And as a result, the life of the parts and the types of parts that are going into the unit make your current contract no longer a good fit for the actual parts that you have in the unit and the maintenance profile going forward. A fourth opportunity we'll see is where a new owner maybe purchases the plant and they want to bring the contract, the LTSA that's already at the plant, in line with their existing fleet of contracts. And so, that's yet another opportunity for the parties to get together, look at the terms, and perhaps renegotiate the contract. Maybe the owner's having financial difficulty. That's another unfortunate situation, but because of the way that the payments and the billing is structured, back when the contract was originally signed, is no longer working, and now the contract is becoming or making the plant really economically uncompetitive because of the high cost of the contract. And rather than risk insolvency, the owner has to do something to get those costs down, and so they look to the OEM or the service provider to help them with that by opening up the contract, looking at the billing, maybe making some adjustments, and again, that's another opportunity. And finally, I guess that another situation where we'll see these contracts come up for renegotiation is when an owner is having issues with the service provider. Maybe there's just repeated poor performance. We're at loggerheads, and the owner and the service provider are threatening each other for breach and default. And as part of kind of that resolving those disputes, there's an opportunity to open up the contract to maybe make some changes and address some of those issues, as well as some of the other ones that we're going to talk about or have already talked about today.
So I think it's safe to say, in my 7-year of a 25-year agreement, I should not assume that I'm locked into that agreement. I should either seek some help to interpret the agreement, or really go and read through the contract, see what my options are.
Well, definitely know your contract, know your terms, and know what these opportunities may be, and be prepared for when they come up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and so moving to you, Bill. So what's material in an LTSA, and what should we be evaluating?
When a LTSA is signed, there's a great deal of effort by the owner to look at his cash flows, to look at and build a pro forma around the plant and expected operating profile. And that was good at the time the contract was signed. But now you need to look at this next 10 years of operation. This next 10 years, we've talked about the changes in landscape that are going to occur. And you have to look at that contract, and does it allow you the flexibility that you're going to need? Does it allow you to change operating profile? Is it an operating assumption violation? Does it allow you to deviate, to run longer, to run less between outages?
Yeah, so what do you mean by an assumption violation as you talk about the contract?
So pretty much all the LTSAs have a block in the contract that kind of lays out the parameters that was assumed to be operational as the plant was built. And it's going to have things like what kind of fuel quality and what kind of water quality must be used. But it also has a lot of times an operating profile, either limiting the number of hours to use. It might even have penalties. And a lot of times, and we've also seen them where there's no flexibility at all. It was like, you will run X many hours a year.
Oh.
And if you run less, you pay. Or if you run more, you pay. There's no latitude for that. It's you're in violation, which allows the other party to then interpret what damages that has incurred.
Okay, understand.
Another point to look at is what this new operating profile is going to be, the wear and tear that's going to be putting on the equipment. In the end, your service provider needs equipment that runs and an owner that makes profit and can pay the bills. And that's going to lead to the next level of probably negotiation points, was as more units see part load operation, traditional billing and traditional methodology for evaluating wear and tear and charging for the unit is either hours or starts. And really load isn't factored in there. So unless you trip a unit and you have a high starts factor associated with that, that's ignored. But the reality is that when you run a unit at less than firing temperature, the parts are less stressed. And as that becomes more material to the contract, that will need to flow through into the cost that the owner bears. And this is a fact that's probably going to have to be changed, and we'll see some movement on in the coming years.
So another point to consider is escalation. While the escalation of the LTSA dollar amounts is not influenced by kind of these trends that we talked about earlier, within the last 5 to 10 to 15 years, we've seen a number of changes in the escalation clauses themselves in an LTSA. Over the years, we've seen escalation tied to everything from just a single index like CPI to a blend of indices like a labor and material index. We've seen fixed escalation or fixed adjustments at just a fixed rate. And so, there's been a lot of changes in kind of how owners and service providers are viewing escalation in the contract. And there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. So each owner needs to really look at, the escalation clauses in their contract and figure out what's the best approach for their contract and for their business. For example, if you have a power purchase agreement or an O&M agreement or a fuel supply agreement, you want to be considering the escalation clauses in those contracts as well as the escalation clause in your LTSA, and try to align them as best you can so that your revenues are escalating at the same rate or similar as much as you can to your expenses. So you don't really get a huge disconnect there where you've got greater escalation of the dollars going out than you do of the dollars coming in.
Yeah.
So as the number of ways of looking at escalation has evolved over the years, we've seen some new concepts come into escalation clauses. For example, Bill mentioned earlier, bad behavior or bad instances drive changes in contracts. Well, several years ago, I had many owners who had LTSA contracts that had their escalation tied to a labor and material index. And as the price of steel, which was the material index piece of that, was rising dramatically, it was causing obviously the escalation in the contract to go up, up and up, and it was just killing a lot of the owners and the revenues that they were making, or eating away at that, I should say. And so that drove kind of the introduction of the concept of a ceiling and a floor in an escalation contract. We've also seen introduction of clauses like hyper-escalation. So there's a number of different things that the owners need to be considering and that you need to be thinking about as you look at escalation in your contract in the future. The main point is that as the cost of service and the maturity of the technology and the increase in competitiveness is driving down the cost of the service, escalation is causing the cost of the service to the owner to continue to rise. And so, that's going to be certainly something that the owners will want to look at as they evaluate their LTSA going forward.
Yeah, and I think actually as you focus on what's important in a contract, you may be focusing on the scope, you may be focusing on the warranties, on the coverages, and then there could be just this small little provision that sits there in the contract that ultimately is going to cost you a lot of money over time, and it might not be the focus.
No, absolutely, it's often not the focus until it becomes until it starts really impacting. One other thing I would add is I think it's really important when you go to evaluate your escalation clause is to really benchmark it. Get out there, see what others are doing. You don't want to just rely on kind of how you've done things in the past. But talk to owners, talk to consultants, talk to experts, and really
utilize your user groups.
Exactly, and see what others are doing so that you can kind of get a better feel for what may work best for you and your contract. Another thing to consider is how the payments are structured. Many LTSAs are set up so that the owners prepay for their planned maintenance inspections based on how the gas turbine operates. This often comes in the way of either a dollar per factored fired hour or a dollar per factored start. And this allows the owner to have more or less of a levelized payment over the maintenance interval. The problem is that as this maintenance and operating profile changes, the cash flows or the cash payments that the owner is making don't necessarily always keep up with that. And it can result in the owners owing huge true-ups when they get to the outage. For example, if the contract is set up so that the owner pays on a dollar per factored fired hour, but their maintenance or their operating profile starts changing where they're cycling more, then they may get to the outage based on factored starts. And at that point, the revenues that have been collected by the service provider don't match the outlays that the service provider needs to make by way of influx of parts and services to actually do the outage. And so the owner may be faced with a huge true-up payment that can be due at the outage. And depending on how the revenues have gone over the maintenance interval, they may not have that money readily available to make that true-up payment. So as looking at these, and looking at the contracts going forward, owners need to be thinking about, or will want to think about, how can we better structure payments to truly match how this change in operation is going to happen over time.
And another, when you're talking about how the contracts are set up for payment, another one that probably isn't even considered in the contract is the ability to peak fire or under fire the unit. And as we go forward, that's another thing that for a unit that's maybe not operating as much, the opportunity to run a short period of time in a peak fire mode, yes, it accelerates maintenance, but it could be a very high revenue generating time. Yeah. So that's something to also consider as you're looking again this forward landscape change.
Yep. And that underfiring, that's essentially like running at part load, like you mentioned earlier, where you're not necessarily using up all the life in the parts.
So you have it works both ways. You can either underfire the unit in hours of low operation and hopefully build credits maybe, or build value with or at a reduced fee, or be able the opportunity to run hot and really accelerate the use on the parts. But in the end, because your number of hours of operation are so low or relatively low to plan, it's not going to affect you for the outage until maybe 15 years from today.
Yep. Yep.
I think the final point that I would say in terms of provisions that need to be evaluated, or a major provision that needs to be evaluated, is termination rights. And certainly as you look at your LTSA and evaluate what things you want to renegotiate or consider going forward, having the right to terminate the contract is a key one. There could be any number of reasons why an owner may want to get out of a contract. For example, they may have a PPA that's expiring. They need to release themselves of their LTSA obligations in connection with that. The plant may have sold or may be up for sale, and the new owner doesn't want to take the contract, and the owner may need to get out in that instance. Unfortunately, a lot of times the LTSA, as we've mentioned earlier, may be a cost burden, and it's really just dragging down the economics of the project. And so the owner has to do something, and the LTSA is one way to kind of reduce those O&M costs. And then, finally, as we've alluded to earlier, there could just be really poor performance repeated, and the owner is looking at it and saying, why do I want to be in a long-term contract with a service provider that I'm continually getting, poor performance? Yeah. And so, looking at how you can get out of the contract is going to be a key component to evaluate as you're doing your overall evaluation of the LTSA. Obviously, any service provider is going to push back on more outs and more rights to terminate. But I think it's important to have the flexibility, and I'm sure we've all seen in contracts that we've reviewed. Owners will come to you and saying, well, how do I get out of this? And you say, well, there's really no way. You can intentionally default and make them try to terminate you that way, but you don't really have a lot of termination rights, and that's a difficult conversation to have and a difficult position for an owner to be in. Another point on termination, and I know we said earlier that a lot of contracts won't reach the end of their natural term. But one thing to think about is, what flexibility does an owner have at the end of the term? And by that I mean, most contracts are tied to an outage event as the end of the term. And it may be a hot gas path or a major inspection. But as you approach the end of the term, as this operating profile is changing, you may be in an instance where you don't actually reach that last inspection before you kind of reach a sunset date. And so, owners will want to think about what flexibility do they have in terms of that last outage. Can you move it up if you need to? Is that even practical? Can you push it out? Can you extend the term to make sure that you get that last inspection? Or can you drop the inspection altogether? So having, building in that flexibility for an end of term situation is also a really important thing to think about. A lot of times people say, well, this is a 20-year agreement or a 30-year agreement. I'm not going to be here. It's not going to be my problem. But it is going to be somebody's problem. So, you definitely want to be thinking about that.
Yeah. And I think when you're going in to negotiate an agreement, you're thinking scope, you're thinking commercial terms, but probably thinking about the end of the agreement is not something that really is prevalent on people's minds. I think it's a great point to bring up.
Absolutely.
So Bill, with contracts being renewed and modified, what are the objectives in a competitive environment?
Well, if you look at this graphic, basically anytime there's an opportunity to extend or renew, it's a fork in the road. For sure, the easy button is going down more of the same path. Going down the easy path misses the opportunity to change the trajectory of the LTSA for the next 10 years. And it also misses the opportunity to take advantage of all the changes that have occurred over the last 20 years. It also misses the opportunity to bring in competition. And regardless of whether you really want to change suppliers or not, talking to multiple suppliers in a competitive environment is going to give you insight and knowledge of what's available in the market. So you may be an expert on your own LTSA agreements, but until you bring in competition, you really don't know where the market is. Also be that that you may be an expert on your agreements, but there's so many flavors of LTSAs you can't even count them. Don't be afraid to use a consultant in this matter. Yeah. The end point is unless you go really pulse the market, you just don't know what's out there. So taking the easy button kind of misses all of that. Then another point you might want to look at is in the editing and creating the document. Another easy button is that you let your supplier edit and create the document. And really the best way to get all of your needs in a contract is to originate the document and control the edits.
And it sounds like going down that easy path it really is just you don't know what you don't know. You're comfortable with your own agreement, so you can quite easily walk down that path, and it really can be to the betterment of the supplier as opposed to maybe the betterment.
Yeah, and then you kind of revisit that editing and creating your own document. I mean that's a big deal, and if you don't really have the ability, that's another opportunity to bring in a consultant and write and who can write a competitive agreement for you and create that first pass document.
Yep. So Jason, let me ask you, what are the pitfalls we should avoid during a negotiation of an agreement?
Well, I would say first and foremost, don't wait until the end to kind of check yourself. To reach out to others, to reach out to experts, to kind of find out, what's going on. Not too long ago, I had a client call me and said, hey, look, we've been negotiating this LTSA for the last 6 months. We're getting ready to sign. We're going to take it up for management approval. Can you just take a quick look, right? And let us know if we've missed anything. And, at that point, everything's been negotiated. It's really difficult to bring up new points at that point in the process. So, don't wait until the end. Get that involvement early on to kind of guide you through the process. The second thing I would say is be careful about working from the precedents of your own agreement. As Bill had alluded to earlier, it's easy to just take your contract, modify a few terms, tweak a few things to kind of address what we're doing now, and just go into the next 10 or 20 years. And that can really, again, miss opportunities. So while it's fine to do an amend and restate, you still want to kind of evaluate each provision in your contract and think about how that compares to kind of those same provisions in the marketplace, and kind of take advantage of those opportunities. And the third thing I would say is that the process you follow matters. As Bill had also mentioned earlier, Allowing the OEM or the service provider to take the pen and to turn the first draft really puts you in the defensive situation. So I always advise clients, look, take the contract, take the pen, put everything you want into the contract first, and then put it over to the other side. As I'm sure people have realized in doing this in the past, it's so much easier to try to argue to keep something in the contract and to negotiate to keep it in than it is to try to bring something new into the contract. While I would be in a better position, I would prefer to have others trying to argue to get something out of the contract. I don't want to have to be arguing to try to get something into the contract. So the process definitely matters.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some great points. Just going back to the original agreement, people will be comfortable with that agreement.
Sure.
So they'll be confident and competent and
Right.
will feel like they can negotiate from that. But that might not be the best path because they're missing the opportunity to get what a market balance agreement should have in it.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you can't use your own agreement as the basis document. But don't just think that we're just going to tweak a term here and there and that's going to be enough, because that really misses out on this this opportunity to kind of evaluate each provision and compare it to what's out there.
Yeah, great points.
All right, so I would like to add, timing. You never know when these opportunities for renewal come about, so you need to be ready. You need to have a wish list prepared of what items you like to change in your contract, and just like a yearly budget, review your LTSA, have a wish list. If you need to, use a consultant to help you build the wish list. That way, you're ready to go. Also, don't assume that your current provider is really the sole and best answer. Go pulse the market. There's a lot of people out there driving very competitive agreements with success, and at least check them and look at them. And then lastly, really there is no downside. The downside is you continue with your existing agreement. So the ability to be ready to challenge your supplier, to provoke them with, to challenge them with providing you a better contract to meet your needs, go do it. Just do it.
Yeah. So what's the best way, if I'm listening to you, I want to pulse the market, what's the best way for someone to actually go pulse the market?
You can do a couple things. You can work user groups, you can work your peer group, you can just bring in suppliers and have them do a demonstration of capability. Yeah. You can actually go so far as to write an RFP. That's probably the most thorough thing to do, is actually write an RFP. That way everybody's on a standard playing field as what their capabilities are, and then you can measure one against the other. And there's nothing that, even in a contract, there's nothing to prevent you from going out for an RFP and just pulse how things are.
One of the things you mentioned with an RFP, I think it's a great idea because, as I'm sure everyone knows, each supplier kind of has a different set of offerings. And doing an RFP allows you to really get an apples to apples comparison, because if you don't do that, then you're comparing, well, what is term warranty versus covered maintenance? How do those compare, And so doing an RFP gets everybody on the same evaluation level. And then you can really see, well, who's really providing me the best offering at the best price.
Great point. Yeah. So Jason, could you walk us through some of the key takeaways to a successful negotiation?
Sure. So, as we talked about early, do your analysis early. Don't wait until the time to negotiate to kind of know what you want. So start early. Bill suggested, I think it's a great idea, annually, just kind of review your contract, look at, things, because as the market changes, I think each year it's a good idea to just kind of see what's changed recently, and really know, kind of have your wish list ready to go. The second thing I would say is benchmark. I think it's critically important to kind of know what's out there. That way you can at least know that you're getting the best deal. And as we've mentioned earlier, the best way to do that is through an RFP. If you have the resources in-house to do that, by all means, use that. If you don't, as we talked earlier, there are, go outside of your organization, talk to users group, talk to your peers, bring in experts, consultants. They can help you kind of run that process, and I think that's really important to kind of allow you to really do that benchmarking. And then the final thing I would say is to think about maximizing your agreement for the next 10 years. Bill mentioned earlier on, a lot of changes in the agreements come about because of bad experiences, and so we're trying to kind of address what's happened in the past. And that loses that opportunity to kind of think ahead and think about, well, what's going to happen in the future, and let's make sure we're doing the best to kind of address those issues head on before they actually become issues that we have to deal with looking back.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because that's a very common approach, is to fix all the things that were in the prior agreement.
Right.
It's kind of like driving your car looking through the rear view mirror instead of looking forward.
Exactly. Great analogy.
So Bill, have you anything that
I would still look at, look at the in-source, outsource rebalance. When these contracts are written, there's maybe a lot of discomfort about the, working on the equipment or owner capability. There's maybe a gap in supplier base. Those have changed. So when you redo your agreement, you want to rebalance your DOR to what makes cost-effective sense. And you may have had staff go up, staff go down. Either way, it's a good opportunity to look at that and get that set right to how you want to manage the contracts going forward. And then lastly, just kind of talked about it before, it's actually, it's a detriment if you're not ready. It's a positive if you are ready. And Jason talked about it before, we can't stress enough that these renewals and extensions very often, which is really what our marketplace is today. There's not that many new units going in. There's not that many units going to end of term. It's going to be a renewal of an extension is going to be the vast majority of your opportunities to renegotiate, and being ready and taking that in a proactive business stance is really going to make all the difference.
Yep.
Craig, I guess you want to wrap us up now?
So I'd like to take a moment to thank our panel for their insightful comments, which I hope have helped you get a better understanding of the LTSA environment, and would like to leave you with a few parting thoughts. Renewable energy will continue to grow, we all know that, and electricity demand will stay flat. It is ever more pressing to ensure that all aspects of plant operations are considered to ensure safe, economic, and efficient operations of your gas plants, and that includes being informed and proactive around your LTSA. Would like to leave you with these three important takeaways. First, it's important to know where you are and where you are going in the long run, and to benchmark the competitiveness of your maintenance services. You don't need to have in-house capabilities to do this. You can use consultants, user groups, or peers to support you. Second, start early. Negotiation takes time, and as Jason mentioned, being rushed to sign an agreement in a time crunch is not a good place to negotiate from. Further, you don't know when you may need it. And finally, the end goal should be to get commercial flexibility that supports the required dynamics of your gas plant. Three areas that should be focused on are price, escalation, and termination. Well, that's it for this webinar. I'd like to thank you for listening in, and if you have any questions about what we've talked about, or would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to contact us. Our details are on the screen, as well as on our virtual vendor fair booth landing page. Thank you.